Hey guys, welcome to Solo ReacTalk. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video requested. It's called Rise of the Nations Between Two Wars 1918, One of Two, and the channel's name is Time Ghost History. Okay, let's start. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go.
At the end of 1918, the Great War is over, but in Europe, on the now silent battlefields, there are new nations and new leaders springing up, and those battlefields will soon see a lot of renewed warfare as those nations fight each other or fight themselves in civil war. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the inter-warriors covering the life, uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria of the 1920s, the descent of that life into the poverty, suspicion, fear, and autocracy of the 1930s, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Nidell. As soon as the Great War is over, a huge change comes over Europe. In the vacuum created when
The Great War is World War One, right? I hope I'm right about that. I'm not entirely sure.
the Central Powers collapsed and the Russian Civil War rages on in the East, new nations arise. Poland becomes independent again after 123 years of partition. Czechoslovakia becomes a republic. A Hungarian Democratic Republic is declared. Latvia declares independence from Russia. The British military government of Palestine begins. Montenegro becomes part of Serbia. Iceland regains independence from Denmark. Transylvania again becomes part of Romania. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is established. Now, it's important to note that although these lands have in some way maybe existed before in history, they have never been nation states, nor have they ever been truly independent. Most certainly they haven't been constitutional democracies, not ever. They arise out of the ruins of an old system of feudal allegiances, where the land might have had the name they adopt when they become countries, but rather than countries, they had been the land dependencies of a complex system of more or less interrelated dukes, princes, kings, queens, emperors, and empresses. In the past 200 years, some of them have achieved some representation of the people, but were never self-governing. Some of them, like Poland, might have been independent kingdoms for a while at some point. But even then, they were the lands of some family, not the lands of the people. There has been much research on the concept of national identity, right? The majority of historians today agree that before the 18th century, there was no such thing. Some studies even indicate that a widespread sense of nationality doesn't arise until shortly before the beginning of the 20th century, or even only with the World War.
Okay, national identity. I mean, I would have thought, like nations that were having, or nations that were represented by a kingdom, people would have that national pride and national identity towards that kingdom. I mean, like if you speak a particular language and you live in a particular area, you would have that nation identity. Like if you were on in the British Islands, the British Isles, if you were in mainland Europe, if you were European, if you were French, then, you belong to the French kingdom. If you were speaking Spanish, then you belong to the Spanish kingdom. And, they also identified themselves probably with their crests. I don't know if they used flags per se, but something to identify as saying that I come from this particular land. Wouldn't that be also part of a national identity? I'm not sure if you understand what I'm trying to say, but yeah, I'm a bit confused with this notion that the idea of national identity only comes into fruition in the 20th century. Yeah.
During the 19th century, there was, though, a concerted effort by politicians and intellectuals to promote national identity, especially as identity politics almost always connects with interest politics. This all contributed to the complex web of conflicts that led to the Great War. Now, after that war, or perhaps because of it, that has pretty much succeeded, and nationalism is the standard way of looking at the world. But there's a problem. Although the nationalist movement has already created a definition, or actually many conflicting mythical definitions, of what these new nations are and where they came from, reality is much more complex. In Central and Eastern...
Okay, I'm sorry. I just need to maybe minimize the screen a bit so we can see what has been, shown here, so it's not blocked by my video. Okay.
Eastern Europe, where many new nations now arise, there has been a balance held in place since 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia that settled the previous identity conflict between Protestants and Catholics within the Habsburg Empire. The idea is that national identity is based on some mix of ethnicity, geography, religion, whatever else. Unfortunately for the now fervent nationalists, there are no natural borders on which to base these new divisions. If the lines have ever existed at all, they've never been clear. So no matter which way you cut it, a lot of people with any given language and common cultural identity will end up on the wrong side of some border. And you move that border a little to fix that, and it's another language group that gets split instead. Now, this might sound trivial to those who are not affected, but it's certainly not to those who feel strongly about national identity. And in 1918, some people are starting to feel very, very strongly about national identity. So this is not some academic analysis or political opinion from our time. It's a real, tangible issue that will have catastrophic effects. You see, people will start wars over this, steal each other's property, rob them of their rights, incarcerate, torture, and mass murder each other over identity starting now in the autumn of 1918 as the new borders are drawn. And Germany, that last man standing that finally stopped fighting the war on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, well, a week before that happens, sailors of the Imperial High Seas Fleet mutinied in Kiel. The mutineers were imprisoned, but thousands of civilians marched in the streets demanding their release. Shots were exchanged and over 30 men were killed or injured. This is usually seen as the beginning of the German Revolution, which soon broke out in cities like Wilhelmshaven, Hanover, Braunschweig, and Munich. Actually, in Munich, a workers' council forces the last king of Bavaria, Ludwig III, to abdicate, and a Bavarian free state is declared. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II is also forced to abdicate, and a revolutionary council of people's deputies is proclaimed, led by the Social Democrats and Friedrich Ebert. While revolutionary forces continue to fight for regional Soviet-style republics, the moderate parties under Ebert are fighting for a democratic federal union. For all practical purposes, Germany is now at civil war.
Okay, so the Civil War began just as they signed the peace, or should I say the armistice, after the Great War. Is that what happened? Like they couldn't continue on with the war, so they just had to stop it because they were having political situations at home. Yeah, I think that's what he was saying. I don't know. I'll have to watch this again. Yeah, like this is a lot of information to process.
Nation at civil war is Russia. After the November Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik leadership under Lenin had withdrawn from the World War. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty gave Germany huge swaths of land all over Eastern Europe, which had, with Germany's defeat, become many of the new Eastern European nations. Some regions also seceded from Russia during the Civil War, while counter-revolutionaries tried to turn the tide. The by now fairly well-organized Bolshevik forces, the Reds, face a mess of different counter-revolutionary factions, the Whites. Now these imperialists, Democrats, proto-fascists, monarchists, and God knows what else, are fighting bitterly not only against the Reds, but also for control of the war between each other. While Germany and Russia continue to burn and nations form all over Europe, there's also unrest in many other parts of the world. In China, the new republic that had deposed the emperor in 1912 is already falling apart. Although the Republic of China still exists officially, in reality, the country is now under control of local warlords. Other parts of China are under Japanese control. Japan had fought on the side of the Allies in World War I and expanded its influence on the Asian.
Isn't that interesting? Japan fought alongside the Allies in World War One, but in the Second World War they became the enemies of the Allied nations in Europe and America. That's very interesting how things have just changed. But I think it's due to the political climate that also changed in Japan during that time. I think, yeah.
Mainland and in the Pacific. Together with the U.S., they're now involved in eastern Siberia in an attempt to stop the Bolsheviks from establishing control of the Russian Pacific Rim. On the Japanese home islands, a fragile democracy had been established in 1912, but the Taisho democracy is now under threat from a popular rise of fascism striving for expansion and militarization. In India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, France and Britain have tightened their control over their colonial dependencies. Nevertheless, there is increasing unrest as the peoples of these regions watch new independent nations arise all over the rest of the world. In the Middle East, the British have made the Emir Faisal king of Greater Syria a British dependency. They've also promised him a new pan-Arabic nation. This is a reward for uniting the Arab tribes, together with Lawrence of Arabia, on the side of the Allies against the Ottoman Empire and the other Central Powers. But the intricate web of financial interest, oil fields, and agreements like Sykes-Picot that divides up the region between France and Britain, or the Balfour Declaration that promises a Jewish state in Palestine, now stand in the way of a united Arabia. So, as 1918 ends, the armistice of World War I is not yet a peace treaty, nor is there any peace, and it will stay like this for some time. The wars will rage on, and a peace treaty that will be forged in Paris at the peace conference that is about to begin will be fraught with weakness. Instead of solving the budding ethnic conflicts, it will fan them. But before we get to all of that, in our next episode, we'll take a look at the Spanish flu, which had as much of an impact on 1919 as the war did. To get our episodes ahead of time and support us to make more content like this, join the Time Ghost Army on Patreon or directly on our timeghost.tv website. There you can also sign up for our forum for free. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Time Ghost and World War II on YouTube. World War II week by week starts September 1st, 2018. See you next time. Until then, be a mensch.
Well, guys, that's it for the Rise of the Nations between two wars, 1918, one of two, made by Time Ghost History. National identity. Sometimes it sounds good, being proud of your nation, being proud of where you come from and all that kind of stuff, but it also has bad connotations to it. And it was clearly evident that, after World War I, when these new nations were created, with this national identity spreading across all of them, that it was not going to be good for everybody. And that's what happened. There were some groups and some people and communities that were ostracized by these new nations because they did not speak the same language, or they did not look the same in terms of ethnicity, or they did not believe in the same religion, and thus there was animosity created, there was fear and hatred and xenophobia, and it created a lot of resentment and pain and suffering for many communities that were stuck in between. They just woke up one day probably and they just realized that now they are part of a different nation when they were part of a far larger kingdom. Now all of a sudden they're being told that they're part of a particular nation and their community is within its borders, and now they have to obey and accept the government of the day, over their land. So it can have good aspects to it, national identity, but it also has some bad connotations to it. And I guess after World War One, the entire political structure of royalties, the kings, the queens, the dukes and duchesses, all these people who ruled vast tracts of lands, was coming to an end. People wanted a different form of governance. Kings were abdicating their thrones, like the king of Bavaria, I think he said, the king of Kaiser, the king of Kaiser in Germany also abdicated. The king or the emperor in China were also abdicated or defeated by his own military. There was a military coup. Military warlords were taking over. In Japan, things were also a bit shaky there. New groupings of extremely fascist and idealistic and expansionist and imperialistic people were trying to take over the government in Japan as well, and the former colonial powers, or should I say the colonial powers during that time, also were trying to further entrench their hegemony over vast tracts of lands, just to make sure that the resources are secure, that there aren't any problems, that they create puppet kingdoms, puppet nations that would be at their behest. And there was a lot of chaos created after World War One. Some of it was necessary, some of it was totally unnecessary, but it's like the Arab Spring of that time, I think, that wave of change. And it came with good intentions, some of it, and ended with bad results. So yeah, I guess I'm thinking about watching the entire playlist for Between Two Wars. Probably I will put it in this slot for Tuesday. So every Tuesday it will be Between Two Wars, and hopefully you guys will also be there to watch it with me. I'm gonna watch this episode again because there were some parts that I still didn't understand completely, but I think I'm going to enjoy this. Yeah, I think I'm really going to enjoy this. So guys, hopefully you'll also be there for I think it's going to be part 2 or episode 2. Yeah, 1 of 2. Yeah. That's going to come next week, Tuesday. And remember, if you like the video, you can give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I will see you next week, Tuesday. Okay? Bye-bye.